Hello and welcome to the state of Kentucky. I'm Bruce Maples, the publisher of Forward Kentucky, and we're glad to have you with us today. We have some very special guests. I'm very excited to have them on here. It is not unrealistic, though, to say that the reason that we're talking to these two guests is maybe not as enjoyable or thrilling. Before, though, we get to the guests, I want to share a couple of things real quickly with all of you. First of all, we do take sponsorships. So if you are interested in sponsoring this show, go to the sponsor page on our website. It's very simple and it's not very expensive, frankly. It's a good way to get your message out. Obviously, these things cost money. So if you want to support our work, you can go to forwardky.com/join and become a paying member. And finally, if you comment on Facebook or YouTube, we can see the comments and we may show them in the broadcast. So let's talk for just a moment to set everything up. We've gone through 4 years of an administration in Washington that just decided to break norms from the beginning and continued to break them and continued to break them and so on and so forth. But I'm not sure that any of us expected to see what we saw last Wednesday. There had been hints of it. There had certainly been lots of talk among certain people about we need a new civil war and so on and so forth. But I think most of us thought, yeah, a lot of that is just, talk. And then the talk suddenly wasn't talk. And if you were like me, you sat by your television or your screen on your computer and watched the whole thing happen for some period of time. We're very fortunate, I think, that we don't have more fatalities to talk about. But even so, we have to talk about what happened and what's next. So first, I'd like to bring in Congressman Awesome. That's what we call him. Congressman John Yarmuth from Louisville. Congressman Yarmuth, welcome to the state of Kentucky.
Thanks, Bruce. Good to be with you.
I have.
Good to be with
yes, I told you when we were talking before the show that I could probably spend an hour just talking about last Wednesday with you, but I don't want to be unrespectful of your time. So let me just ask. I've got two questions about Wednesday, basically. How bad was it?
It depends on where you were. I was in my office, and I thought I only had fear for myself for about 30 seconds. I've talked to many of my colleagues who were in the chamber or in the Capitol, and it was a very different experience for them. For me, it was just more surreal than anything else. And as I've actually written, I usually can intellectualize these kinds of things and put them in context. I have not been able to yet. The idea that American citizens who claim to be patriotic would essentially declare war on other American citizens is something that I've yet to be able to process.
So what is, without going into the whole day, what is your most indelible memory of that day?
I would say the views of people hanging from the Capitol building.
Okay.
All of the things, and of course, we've seen so much more in the ensuing days, and I agree with those people who say every day for a while it's gotten worse. We've learned more. Some of it seems even more and more incomprehensible. The idea that American citizens would actually defecate in the halls of Congress is something that is just beyond all comprehension. But I would say those visuals of people hanging from the building, trying to get in, was reminiscent of so many images we've seen in third world countries. And that to me, and of course, the one thing that I did not see at the time, but since, is the one insurrectionist, I will call him, uh, beating a Capitol Hill policeman with an American flagpole.
Yes, which has become one of those images that's going to be with us for a while. What was the mood in the chamber when you all finally regathered, when they secured the building? What was the mood in the chamber when you finally regathered?
I would say shock more than
Okay.
anything.
Uh,
Shock and sadness.
That's interesting, because I remember that of all the tweets and comments I saw as it was happening, yours talked about how sad it was. And I was struck by that. When did the movement start toward impeachment or removal? When was that? I think I read that some people started doing those articles during the siege.
That may have been true. I wouldn't put it past Jamie Raskin and Ted Lieu and some of the others who actually drafted it. But it was almost immediate. Within hours, certainly.
Okay, so let's talk about that. Why just one article of impeachment? A number of people have said, why wouldn't you have added the call to Georgia as, an impeachable offense?
Okay, I think the rationale, and I tend to agree with it, is that we wanted to take the clearest cut case. So we could have written a treason article, but that would have that's more of a qualitative argument. This was cut and dried. The president did this, said this, so forth, and incited an insurrection. And we wanted to take the one article that would be able to attract, hopefully, the greatest amount of bipartisan support. And some of the other things we could have done might have pushed some Republicans away. So we thought this was the surest way to get some Republican support and possibly get a conviction.
Were you surprised positive or negative about the 10 Republicans who did vote for impeachment? Were you surprised that anybody did, or were you surprised that more didn't?
Well, at the time when we started talking about impeachment, I was surprised, would have been surprised if any had. Then, of course, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger and a few more announced they were. So I actually thought on the day of the vote, I thought we might get up to 20. So I was a little bit surprised that we didn't get more than 10. But again, it was the most bipartisan impeachment vote in history, even though there were only 10 Republicans voting.
So why not more? I mean, it seems to those of us sitting out here in the cheap seats, it seems obvious that this was, inciting insurrection. Why wouldn't more Republicans have voted for that, particularly after they came after the vice president of all things?
Of course, you'd have to ask them, but I would say that they're afraid of their own constituencies. And, right now the electorate is so polarized that Republicans can never expect to get any Democratic votes. And so the one thing that they're really reluctant to do is to alienate any Republicans. And certainly a substantial amount of Republicans would not be supportive of a member who voted to impeach Donald Trump. So it's all electoral concerns, Bruce. I think that's the safest way to say it. They're just being reelected was more important to them than defending the Constitution.
But there have also been reports that some of them are actually fearful for their own physical safety if they vote against Trump.
That's true, and that doesn't surprise me. Now, I think there are some Republicans, and I think it's in Congress a small amount, but I believe them, who say they didn't vote for impeachment because they thought it would further divide the country, and that the president was going to be gone anyway. We weren't going to get him out of office any earlier than he otherwise would. So why go through a divisive process? And I mean, I understand their point, but my response is, this to me was the most heinous act ever committed by President of the United States. And if this is not if we don't use the impeachment clause for this, we might as well take it out of the Constitution.
Yeah. We do have a question from our viewers, so let me put this up on the screen. Will you sponsor investigations into the Klansmen, white supremacists, and Nazis in our county and city police forces?
We need to, yes, we need to take a look everywhere at this. We have basically, you alluded to it earlier, we have taken the position while these people and their creeds, if you call them that, are disgusting, that they were basically harmless. Now we know they're not harmless. And so we have to make sure that every bit of law enforcement, we're going to be doing that with the Capitol Police. I think it's necessary that we do it across the board with law enforcement, with military as well. You know, there's we have to make sure that we rid. You know, you can't get into everybody's heart and mind, but
right?
To the extent we can, and we can hold people responsible for their social media postings, and if they're in a position of responsibility where they have a public safety obligation, we need to make sure they are not going into that effort with a bias against some people.
So now it's, you know, handed over to the Senate, and we're going to talk with Professor Douglas in just a moment about that process. But what if it doesn't pass? What if it fails in the Senate? Then what?
Then President Trump, the distinction that he will have, which will be the first word of his obituary, is the first president in history to be impeached twice. If he is convicted, then there'll just be an added phrase to that. He'll be impeached twice, and he will also have been convicted once. The other thing is that I believe, and Professor Douglas can talk about this, he probably knows a little bit more than I do. I think that if we don't convict him, we cannot then strip him of his post-presidency benefits.
Okay.
And we cannot prevent him from ever serving in public office again. That's something I think a lot of people, including a significant number of Republicans, would like to do.
So, okay, we have another question. And before I put this up, I want to ask you something sort of personal. I don't want details, but I assume that you have occasionally during your public service had threats of physical violence against you and your family and your staff and whomever. And that, as much as I hate to say it, I think that probably goes with the job. Have those increased in the last 6 to 9 months?
No, not really. We have had a few since the events of last Wednesday.
Okay.
And when we take them seriously, when they're more than generalized threats, like where they say, you know, you're going to pay a price for this, which doesn't really mean much. When they're more specific, and they're like, we had one which basically mentioned my address, not specifically my address, but referenced trouble at my address. Those types of things we turned over to the FBI, and the FBI then will pay a visit to those people.
So here's an interesting question. It's 2 parts, so I have to put up the first part. People arguing that democracy functions when elected officials fear the constituency. How do you feel knowing this is a somewhat common sentiment online?
Well, I don't agree with it.
Okay.
I don't. I mean, you know, again, as you mentioned, it does go with the territory to a certain extent. We know there are violent people out there. We know sometimes politicians are targets. We know there is hateful rhetoric, particularly on social media, where it's largely anonymous. So yes, there, you know, we are always looking around wherever we are, just because that natural apprehension. But I don't think that fear makes me, or that concern makes me a better representative of the 3rd District.
Right.
Again, I think we tend to fear voters more than assailants.
Okay. Man, questions are coming in, and I really, like I said, I was trying to be respectful of your time, so I'm going to try and do these quickly. And I had this question too. What about the use of the 14th Amendment if the impeachment fails? Can Congress not then fall back on using that?
Interestingly enough, the 14th Amendment, which basically says if you've been involved in or supported an insurrection, you can't serve in office. We could have tried that. The problem is that there is no, in the 14th Amendment, there is no action to be taken. It basically says that you can't serve, but it doesn't say how you expedite that or implement
Right.
it.
Right.
So there'd be that would, again, with a short time, if we had available, if this had happened a year ago, then we might have taken a lot more time to try and figure out how we can do that.
Okay. One more question from the audience, and then I've got a couple of closing ones, and we'll move on to Professor Douglas. This is one that I was unaware of. Can you talk about the panic button removal? I didn't even know there were panic buttons, although now that I think about it, they certainly make sense. So what's this about?
Well, we all have a panic button under our desk, and fortunately, I've never had to use it. But obviously, that summons Capitol Police immediately if somebody were to come into your office and try to assault you, or if somebody was just causing a commotion in your office.
Right.
One of our members had her panic button stripped out when she actually tried to use it or else find it. And the panic buttons have been taken out of the office. The thing that is so suspicious about that is that if you try to remove it, it will go off. So that whoever took that button out should have set off an alarm, which leads to the possibility that somebody who knew what they were doing, who was familiar with the system, took it out deliberately. But obviously there'll be an investigation of that as well.
So I have two final questions for you. What is your relationship? And I'm not going to be specific about this, even though I read a report about it. What is your relationship with Republicans in general and with the Republicans serving alongside you from our state now that this vote has happened?
Well, my relationship with Republicans has always been very, very good. I've had great friendships that I actually treasure on the Republican side. I often mystify people when I tell them that Trey Gowdy and Mick Mulvaney are good friends of mine, and they are.
And yes, you mystified me the first time you ever said that.
And I guarantee you they are, particularly Trey, are different people in private and in casual conversations than they are on television, and as are most members actually. But what I've said since then, when you have members who have so deliberately violated their oath of office, and in the course of that, and people who have stoked this issue of fraudulent elections and the election being stolen for the last couple of months, and eventually have put us in danger, put us all in danger, and that it's kind of hard to be friends with them and hard to act cordially with them. And what I suggested is that they apologize, and not to us personally, apologize for misleading their constituents, apologize for misleading the country. And one person has already done that, Jim Lankford, the senator from Oklahoma, who I would say was one of the 2 or 3 that shocked me when he voted to overturn the election. Because I've served with Jim, I've been on committees with him, and when he was in the House, and I always thought, even though we disagreed on everything policy-wise, I always thought he was a very thoughtful, moral, upstanding person, and that stunned me when he voted that way. Fortunately, all the members of the Kentucky federal delegation voted to support the Constitution and the election, and except for Hal Rogers, and that Hal Rogers, I don't understand at all, because Hal Rogers is basically invincible in his district, and I can't. Apparently, he said he got a couple hundred calls or letters, but he represents 700,000 plus people like I do, and If it only takes a couple hundred contacts from constituents to make you violate your oath of office, that's pretty disturbing. But my relationship with Brett Guthrie and Jamie Comer and Andy Barr and Thomas Massey, and again, even with Hal up until now, has been very cordial. And I commute with Jamie, consider him a friend, but and that will remain so. Again, they didn't violate their oath of office. They stood up for the election.
Okay. Okay, so here's my closing question. As we go into the weekend, as we go into next week, and as we go into a new presidency, what are your top 3 worries?
Well, continuing violence and just across the country has to be number 1 right now. Number 2 is that the partisan lines in the Congress get even more rigid, and that we're not willing to, on a bipartisan basis, to address the serious challenges that we have in many cases that only Congress can deal with. That's a real fear. Now we have very slim majorities in the House and the Senate. We can only lose about I think 6 votes in the House now to pass anything out of 222. Eventually, if we don't get there are a couple of elections that are contested still. If we don't get any more members, we'll only be able to lose 3 in order to pass to get enough votes. And we have a pretty diverse caucus in terms of their philosophies. We all have pretty much the same goals, but very, very different, great differences on how we get there and to what degree we get there. So that's probably the biggest fear I have. I'm not as concerned about personal safety, so I wouldn't count that as a fear, although it may be a little bit Pollyannish of me, but I do worry about the dividing lines hardening in the country. Again, when I was a staff member many years ago, back in the 70s, party really didn't mean much at all in those in the halls of Congress, because there were liberals and conservatives in both parties, and you were always dealing with the other side because there was always somebody who agreed with you. One other thing I would say that scares me, and it's not just about near term, but what I've seen of Republicans who have come in recent, in the last couple of years, come into Congress, they don't want to govern. They have no interest in governing. That's not why they're here. They're here because they think this is performance art, that they're in a drama and they're playing a role. And the role doesn't include legislating. And you see that with this woman from Colorado, the one who makes a big deal about carrying a gun everywhere. You see it with the QAnon Marjorie Taylor Greene from, they're just here to play a role and be seen and become celebrities and generate an audience. And we've got to get rid of people like that so that we can actually deal with the problem. I think of the line from the American president where he says, we have serious problems and we need serious people to deal with them. And that's where we are in this country right now. So we need more serious people.
Well, I'm going to close with your section by putting up this one comment that I think is true. Time spent listening to Congressman Yarmuth is always time well spent. Congressman, thank you so much for being with us today. Stay safe, and we'll talk again.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for having me.
That was Congressman John Yarmuth, the Democratic congressman from the 3rd District of Kentucky, telling us some about what happened last week and about what's going on with impeachment. And now we're going to bring in Professor Josh Douglas from UK Law School. And he is more than Congressman Yarmuth. He is the expert on impeachment and the Constitution and some of these questions that we have. Professor Douglas, welcome to the state of Kentucky.
Thank you for having me. And I wouldn't say I'm more of an expert than the individual who voted in favor of impeachment, but I'm happy to provide some thoughts.
Well, I have a list of questions for you, so let me pull this up so I can get them right. Let's just quickly, because I'm fascinated by the fact that in the last year, we've all become familiar, if we weren't, with words like positivity rate and emoluments clause and all these things that most people didn't know up till 18 months ago. So I think most people are probably familiar with the impeachment process, but just in case they're not, could you take 1 minute and run us through how it works?
Yeah, well, we've already seen now the second impeachment occur earlier this week when the House voted for the articles of impeachment. The U.S. Constitution says that the House of Representatives has the power and authority to impeach a president for committing high crimes and misdemeanors. That term isn't defined anywhere, and so it really just means whatever Congress thinks it means. There's all these arguments of you can't be impeached for one thing or another thing, or their First Amendment rights, but the law is simply whatever Congress decides is an impeachable offense is an impeachable offense. Now that the House has impeached by a majority vote, they will deliver the article of impeachment to the Senate. At that point, the Senate must take up the article in a trial. There's a really interesting legal question about to happen, which is who presides, because the Constitution says that the Chief Justice of the United States, Chief Justice Roberts, presides over a impeachment trial of the president. But depending on if the trial begins after January 20th, which seems likely, then Donald Trump will no longer be the president. So the question is, does the Chief Justice still preside, or does it simply go to the president of the Senate, that is the vice president, who will be Kamala Harris? So that's going to be something to watch, is to see essentially what do the various actors believe is the correct interpretation of the Constitution, because we've never had an impeachment trial of the president after the president has left office. It takes 2/3 of vote to convict, so that's 67 votes. So essentially Republicans need 17. And then there would be a second vote if there's a conviction as to whether to bar the person from running for office. And the best understanding is that that second vote just requires a majority, but you don't get there until you get that 2/3 first.
Well, there's just all sorts of questions now that come out of what you just said. One is, let's just get this right up front. It's a 2/3 majority of all the senators, or a 2/3 majority of the ones who vote?
2/3 of all the senators.
Oh, so
they need 60.
So if Republicans don't show up, that doesn't change the number. It's still 67.
I believe that's correct. I'd actually have to double check the language of Article 2 of the Constitution, Article 1 of the Constitution. But I believe that's correct, that it's 2/3 of all sitting senators. But I don't think that's an issue, because I don't suspect Republicans are not going to show up. I mean, everyone is sort of under the understanding that 17 Republicans need to join all 50 Democrats to convict.
Well, but that is a question that people have been raising about, well, if 10 Republicans don't vote, then, what does that do to the number? That will be interesting.
And I can take a look at real quick just to double check that. But I believe it is still 2/3.
And yeah, if it said 2/3 of the members present, that would be different.
Right. We can take a look at this real quick. And it's Article 1, Section 2. See, in live research, this is how it happens.
All right.
And so the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment. So that is, and it's 2/3. Oh, it does say it 2/3 of the members present. And the Senate shall have sole power to try all impeachments. When the president of the Senate is tried, so that's the interesting clause about who presides. It says when the president of the United States is tried, the Chief Justice shall preside, and no person shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present. Again, I don't suspect that's actually going to be an issue, but that is what the language of the Constitution says.
So the next question is about the timing of the delivery of the article. there was some discussion about waiting. So the House just holding I guess there's a formal process where they walk it over to the the Senate, and they were talking about waiting 100 days and letting Biden do all this other stuff. What do you think? Have they already delivered it?
No, they've not delivered it yet, and there's no requirement as to when they when they have to deliver it. So they could wait, the 100 days. They could wait longer. I know there was a conversation you just had with the congressman about Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. That is in terms of the disqualification clause. That potentially could be pursued. I know the leadership has said they plan to deliver the articles soon, but there's no requirement as to when they do so, and they can hold back if they want to.
Okay. So then the timing right now, Senator McConnell has said he's not going to pull everybody back. It's not going to start till after the new presidency. So I assume that at that point, the decision about how the trial will proceed, how much time will be allotted, so on and so forth, will fall to Senator Schumer. Is that correct?
I think so, because McConnell will no longer be the majority leader once the two members from Georgia take their seats. So we're waiting on the Georgia election officials to certify those results. My understanding is that they expect to do so by at least January 23rd, if not potentially earlier, but I think January 23rd is the date I've heard. And so at that point, the control of the Senate flips to the Democrats. Will be 50-50, but the vice president would have the tie-breaking vote. So then, yes, Chuck Schumer would become the majority leader and would dictate the various procedural mechanisms for that. Now, I think they'll try to have a bipartisan agreement as to how the process will actually run, but it is true that Schumer would control the Senate at that point.
So let's go back to the earlier question about banning from office. If they vote to if they vote to convict President Trump, he is automatically banned from serving in office again, or they have to take a second vote?
They have to take a second vote. So the conviction is one vote that requires 2/3, and then the second vote, it would include disqualification to hold office, etc. Now, again, it's not clear whether that second vote requires 2/3 or a majority, and the kind of best constitutional understanding for most people is that it just requires a majority on that second vote, because the Constitution says 2/3 for conviction, but then the penalty essentially can include disqualification to hold office, but there would need to be a second vote for that penalty to kick in.
And Congressman Yarmuth mentioned, we sort of, glided through it, but he mentioned stripping President Trump of post-presidential benefits is dependent on the conviction of the impeachment. Is that correct? Or can they do that?
Yeah, Article 1, Section 3 says in terms of a conviction for impeachment, it's disqualification to hold any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. And so, again, you need, that will all be rolled into the second vote, which, again, I think only requires a majority as opposed to the initial 2/3 to convict.
Here's an interesting question from an observer. Can the president be pardoned during the process, even if he were to resign at this point? I'm not sure who would be doing the pardoning.
Well, and a pardon wouldn't reach impeachment, right? So a pardon would be for criminal prosecution. Impeachment is the process that happens in Congress. So they're two separate things. There's speculation that Trump will resign on the 19th to let Pence take over as president and then pardon him. I'm not sure that will actually occur. But again, any pardon only would reach prosecution for federal crimes.
Right, because even if Pence wanted to, he can't pardon him for impeachment.
Correct.
Okay, so if impeachment fails, I asked this with Congressman Yarmuth, what's the deal with the 14th Amendment?
So the 14th Amendment, Section 3 allows, or basically says, people are ineligible to hold office if they've participated in sedition. The exact language is insurrection or rebellion against the United States. And again, it's sort of not clear as to whether Congress could do this based on a majority vote. Whether this would be like a normal law, so that you'd actually have to have the president's signature to pass a law that bars somebody. Could Congress pass a law that names Donald Trump specifically as ineligible? There's a lot of murky legal gray areas here in terms of how to invoke the 14th Amendment, Section 3. But the bottom line is that it does say that no one can be a member of Congress or president if they've taken an oath to uphold the Constitution and then the language is, quote, engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the United States. So that is another path for Congress to look at in terms of barring Trump from being president in the future. But I think would also, and probably the courts would have to resolve how to actually interpret that with respect to a former president.
One thing I noticed when I was studying this, and I wrote an article about it on our website, it mentions not only federal, but also state office, that somebody cannot serve in a state office if they have been guilty of insurrection or rebellion. And they're using the incitement to insurrection against President Trump. And I raised the question of, well, if you have state level elected officials who are doing the same thing, could this be used against them? What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think it arguably does reach them. The question becomes one in particular for state legislators. Each house of the state legislature has the ability to determine the qualifications of its members and expel someone. So I think that, for example, I think there was a legislator from West Virginia who had resigned, who was involved, if I'm remembering that correctly. But if he hadn't resigned, then the West Virginia legislature could expel that person and cite the 14th Amendment, Section 3 as the reason for doing so. I think one of the hard things about the 14th Amendment, Section 3 is that it's written in the passive voice. That is, it doesn't say who the actor is who invokes this language. And so it's really not clear, can Congress do it and actually have the force of law? The way this would work is if Congress were to do something like this with Trump, or a state legislature were to do it for one of its members, and then that person would essentially have to sue and say that this was an improper use of that amendment. Much like everything else with the Trump presidency, we're in really unprecedented waters in terms of how to think about various clauses of the Constitution that have never been invoked before.
So I've got two final questions. One is sort of out of the remit. There's another word that I've learned over the past 18 months, remit, that I invited you here for, and that is a more general observation about what Congressman Yarmuth Donald Trump on our country over time. Do you have any sort of opinions on Trumpism and what it's going to do to our democracy?
I think it's, really scary, and we're at it. I think we're at it in some ways in existential.
Okay, did you hear my question?
I heard the tail end about what Trumpism means for democracy.
That's good. Go with that.
So I think we are at a kind of existential crisis point for our democracy, and it really has to do with the Republican Party, because there's one segment of the Republican Party that seems to not believe in democracy, that will refuse to accept an election loss, that elections have to be fraudulent unless they win. I've been very critical of Senator McConnell over the months and years, but I will say that his statement before the riot occurred was excellent, where he said, what are we doing here in terms of objecting to a free and fair election? Now, I think McConnell should have spoken out much sooner than he did. The fact that it took weeks after the election for him to say something, I think, is really concerning, and it helped to fuel and allow this undercurrent to then balloon into what happened at the Capitol. But in many ways, the question is are we going to have a Republican Party that is more in line of McConnell's thinking, that we can accept the fact that you lose elections? Or is the Republican Party going to be the party of Trump and Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley that simply don't seem to accept democracy? It's a really a difficult question. Now, there's lots of things that have contributed to the fringe of the Republican Party being able to capture so much power. It goes to gerrymandering. It goes to restrictive voting laws. It goes to things like closed primaries, where only registered members of the party can participate. Those things lead to the more extreme wings of the political parties on both sides participating in the primaries, and then so you have further divide between the nominees of each major party candidate. But I think we're really at a crisis point in terms of accepting the core tenet of democracy, which is that the losers accept defeat and live on to fight the next battle.
It's interesting to hear you say that, because we've had Terry Canfield on here a couple of times, and that's basically her argument too, that we have a group of people who really don't want democracy. They want something else. So let me wrap up with this. I realize that predicting the future is dangerous in both sports and politics, but how do you see this playing out with this impeachment?
Yeah, that's really hard to predict, of course. Are there 17 Republicans that are going to go along with the Democrats? I'm skeptical. I'm hopeful, because I think Donald Trump deserved to be impeached, and I think he deserves to not impeached, but convicted for the impeachment, and I think that he deserves to never hold office again. I publicly called for invocation of the 25th Amendment last week as well, because I think that every day that Donald Trump continues to be president after a riot that he incited is a danger to our democratic republic. But politics is a sticky thing, and it's very much going to be a political question. And the further we go away from the riot, I think probably the less likely it is that you'll have more Republicans join in. So my guess is that, unfortunately, Donald Trump won't have the distinction of having be the convicted for impeachment, but will be the first president to have two impeachments in one term in his record.
As much as I would like to say that you're wrong, I suspect you're probably right. But there's the wild card right now of what the investigations turn up, and the longer they wait to do the trial, the more those could turn up.
Well, and certainly if there's evidence that he was plotting with members of Congress or others at the Capitol to have inside help, that would be even more shocking and potentially would give more evidence. And the other question is what happens in 2024. Is he really going to try to run again? At that point, certainly in end of 2023, if he looks like he's going to run again, Congress could pass a resolution or a law then invoking the 14th Amendment, Section 3. So there's no timeline on when that has to occur. It'll be really interesting to see if he tries to run again, if he's not convicted for the impeachment, and what the dynamics of that look like.
I don't want to end on this, but it looks like I'm going to. A number of people are positing Ivanka 2024. So we may be dealing with that. Josh Douglas, Professor Douglas, University of Kentucky Law School. Thank you so much for being with us and for bringing your expertise to bear on these questions. We may have you on again soon.
That'd be great. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you. That was Professor Josh Douglas from UK. We really appreciate him being on. If you have ideas or suggestions for future topics or future guests, send them to tips@forwardky.com. And as always, if you support the work we are doing, become a member at forwardky.com/join. That's it for this week. So we will see you next week.